My name is Anne Sinclair, and today I stand at the threshold of a completely restructured reality, though reaching this vantage point required navigating 2 decades of systematic emotional erosion, calculated dismissal, and the crushing weight of being designated the designated failure of a prominent dynasty. For the first 20 years of my existence, my parents reinforced a singular, unyielding narrative. I was the slow one, the defective cog in a high-achieving machine, while my brilliant sister Claire accumulated Ivy League accolades, prestigious degrees, and unconditional familial adoration. While Claire was enrolled in private violin instruction at the conservatory, immersed in rigorous French immersion programs, and provided with elite SAT tutoring sessions costing exorbitant hourly rates, my own academic struggles stemming from severe dyslexia were met not with remediation or compassion, but with profound shame and financial neglect. When I was 12 years old, struggling immensely to decode letters that continuously swam and inverted themselves across the page, I approached my mother, Evelyn, to request specialized academic intervention. Evelyn merely sighed, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, and informed me with chilling finality that they had already expended substantial resources on educational specialists, and that at some point we simply had to accept the unfortunate reality that some children were inherently unsuited for academic pursuits. I internalized that verdict at 12 years old, believing implicitly that my cognitive processing differences equated to a fundamental lack of human worth. Forced to adapt independently, I abandoned traditional reading methods and forged an alternative cognitive infrastructure, relying heavily on audiobooks, intricate visual diagrams, spatial flowcharts, and architectural frameworks to process information and dissect complex systems. My sanctuary during those isolating formative years was the sprawling Boston penthouse of my paternal grandmother, Eleanor, the formidable matriarch who had single-handedly built Sinclair Holdings from a modest regional office in 1965 into a commercial real estate powerhouse valued by 2024 at $92 million. Every Sunday afternoon, I would take the commuter train to Eleanor's residence, where she would sit with me for hours, poring over historical documents, structural maps, and old corporate portfolios, teaching me to comprehend systems not word by word, but as interconnected architectures. Eleanor would cover my trembling hand with her weathered fingers and tell me that while I read slower than others, I possessed a rare kind of vision that allowed me to perceive patterns, structural flaws, and hidden connections that conventional intellects routinely missed. She insisted that my dyslexia was not a disability, but a different kind of vision entirely, though at the time I could not fully grasp the prophetic weight of her words. Instead, I had to endure another 19 years of functioning as the Sinclair family's deeply embarrassing secret, culminating in festive gatherings where my humiliation was treated as a subtle public sport. The psychological demolition reached its peak during a Christmas dinner in 2018, where 20 relatives gathered around the gleaming mahogany dining table in my parents' opulent Back Bay townhouse to witness the annual performance of Sinclair perfection. My father, Richard Sinclair, who commanded Sinclair Holdings with an autocratic boardroom-tested authority, stood at the head of the table with a raised crystal wine glass and announced to the assembled relatives that Claire had been accepted into Harvard Law School on a full, merit-based scholarship, praising her as the visionary who would propel the family enterprise to unprecedented heights. As the room erupted into thunderous applause, enthusiastic cheers, and unbridled adulation, Richard's gaze drifted down the length of the table toward me, the warmth in his demeanor evaporating instantly into frigid disdain. With a cruel, dismissive pause, he noted that I was also present, eliciting a wave of uncomfortable, muffled laughter from relatives who understood precisely how to mirror the patriarch's contempt. Claire did not defend me. She simply smiled and laughed along with them, reinforcing my absolute isolation. As I stared down at my plate, letting hot tears blur the roasted lamb before me, a thin, papery hand found mine underneath the table. It was Grandma Eleanor, seated directly across from me, her eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying intensity that looked dangerously like unbridled fury directed squarely at her own son. She said nothing that evening, but 3 months later, she summoned me to her penthouse and set in motion a 5-year detonation sequence that would ultimately dismantle the Sinclair empire and expose every single fabrication my parents had constructed. Following my graduation from a local state university in 2022, an institution explicitly deemed unworthy by my parents, I applied for an entry-level administrative position at Sinclair Holdings, desperately seeking a pathway to contribute to the family legacy. Richard begrudgingly hired me as a low-level administrative assistant at an annual salary of $42,000, while Claire was simultaneously appointed chief legal counsel with a base compensation of $280,000 plus lucrative performance bonuses. My daily responsibilities were intentionally menial, consisting exclusively of operating copy machines, reserving conference rooms, and retrieving gourmet coffee for senior executives who consistently neglected to learn my name. I was strictly barred from strategic planning meetings and denied access to legal contracts, yet during those endless hours stationed near the humming copy room, I utilized my unique cognitive strengths to observe, listen, and analyze. When high-level executives engaged in hushed hallway negotiations regarding commercial acquisitions, zoning disputes, and financial restructuring, I mentally mapped out the structural relationships between opposing parties, tracing the flow of capital, and identifying latent conflicts of interest with architectural precision. This specialized analytical skill, honed to compensate for my reading difficulties, was a direct manifestation of the training Eleanor had provided during our Sunday afternoon sessions, where she had taught me to read legal documents as dynamic structural blueprints rather than static text. During one such visit in March 2019, just as her physical vitality began its gradual decline, Eleanor handed me a small brass-hinged mahogany box, instructing me to keep it safe, leave it unopened until the precise moment of necessity arrived, and trust that I would inherently know when that time had come. During that same afternoon meeting, surrounded by photographs chronicling her decades of pioneering commercial real estate development across Boston, Eleanor expressed her deep bitterness toward Richard, stating explicitly that while she had spent 60 years building the company from a single desk, her son had merely inherited it without ever grasping the true meaning of creation or justice. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing, and declared that while Richard judged individuals by external credentials and boardroom performance, she judged people solely by how they treated those who lacked the power to fight back, affirming that I was the sole member of the bloodline who genuinely understood compassion. 18 months later, she succumbed to pancreatic cancer, leaving me as the solitary family member holding her hand in the hospice care unit, while the mahogany box remained safely tucked away in my queen's closet. The catalyst for the final reckoning arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April 2024, when an email with the subject line regarding confidential position restructuring landed in my inbox, notifying me that as part of ongoing organizational optimization, my administrative position was being eliminated effective July 1st. Later that evening, while organizing redundant files near my cubicle, I overheard Richard and Evelyn conferring through the thin drywall of the corner office, discussing the necessity of my termination, because my presence as a low-level secretary, while Claire ascended to the executive suite, looked poorly upon the family's immaculate public image. My mother offered her characteristic gentle rationalization, asserting that they had exhausted all possibilities for my development and that some children simply lacked what it took to succeed, prompting Richard to agree firmly that a generous severance would cast me out toward pursuits more aligned with my severely limited abilities. Standing alone in my cramped cubicle, earning $42,000 a year while sharing a dilapidated Queens studio apartment where rent consumed nearly all my monthly income, the realization settled into my bones like freezing frost. If I acquiesced to this final erasure, I would spend the remainder of my days imprisoned as the family failure, not due to actual inadequacy, but because I had been systematically denied the permission to succeed. The following evening, May 15th, 2024, the grand ballroom of the luxurious Commonwealth Hotel played host to a lavish gala celebration commemorating Claire's monumental achievements, drawing 350 elite guests, including prominent business partners, high-powered corporate litigators, and institutional investors. Adorned in a simple, modest black dress purchased for $79, the absolute maximum my meager budget could accommodate, I navigated through a sea of glittering designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, only to be promptly intercepted near the entrance by Evelyn, who inspected my drugstore makeup and scuffed footwear with undisguised disdain before banishing me to table 27, positioned awkwardly near the service entrance behind a decorative architectural pillar. As a 12-piece orchestra swelled and the crystal chandeliers cast dazzling, prismatic reflections across silk-draped tables, Richard took to the illuminated stage at 8:30 p.m., raising his champagne flute to announce not only Claire's stellar academic record and her prestigious clerkship with a federal appellate judge, but also the crowning jewel of the evening, the immediate designation of Claire as his successor to the corporate throne, complete with the multi-million-dollar Park Avenue family residence, a luxury electric vehicle, and the ultimate inheritance of the CEO position upon his eventual retirement. As the opulent ballroom erupted into a roaring standing ovation, with hundreds of attendees celebrating the consolidation of power while completely ignoring my existence at the back of the room, a silver-haired gentleman in a tailored gray suit detached himself from the shadows near the entrance and walked purposefully toward my table. Identifying himself as Jonathan Ellis, senior partner at the prominent law firm Morrison & Blake and former personal legal counsel to Grandma Eleanor, the attorney produced a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with crimson notary wax, informing me that it contained the authentic, uncompromised final will and testament of my grandmother, executed exactly 5 months after our final Sunday afternoon conversation, with explicit instructions to deliver it to me on the exact day Richard publicly disinherited me. Fleeing the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom to the quiet isolation of a service corridor near the kitchens, my hands trembling violently, I broke the wax seal and unfolded 3 dense pages of legal documentation establishing that Eleanor had formally revoked all prior testamentary documents and bequeathed 51% of her controlling shares in Sinclair Holdings, valued at approximately $47 million, alongside absolute voting rights directly to me. The text of the legal instrument explicitly noted that this bequest was enacted with full awareness of Richard's systematic campaign of exclusion and emotional abuse, affirming unequivocally that I was not slow, but had been intentionally abandoned by parental prejudice that would no longer be permitted to persist from beyond the grave. Crucially, the document stipulated a strict operational condition. To activate this historic bequest, I was legally required to formally petition for an emergency board of directors meeting within exactly 72 hours of receipt, a tight temporal window designed by Eleanor not as a punitive barrier, but as a decisive psychological permission slip to sever my emotional dependence and seize my rightful autonomy. Returning to my modest Queens apartment later that night, I finally unlatched the brass hinges of the mahogany box, unearthing a handwritten personal letter from Eleanor on her private stationery. The original 1965 founding partnership agreement establishing permanent non-dilutable voting rights for foundational shares, and a sleek modern USB drive containing time-stamped digital audio recordings of a March 2018 board meeting where Richard had covertly attempted to strip Eleanor of her majority voting power under the pretext of cognitive decline, a treacherous coup that had been successfully blocked by Eleanor and her steadfast ally, Margaret Coleman. At precisely 9 a.m. the following morning, I placed a direct telephone call to Margaret Coleman, the legendary septuagenarian co-founder of the empire who had helped build half of Boston alongside my grandmother in the 1970s. Margaret answered on the second ring, confirming immediately that she was fully aware of the secret will and pledging her unwavering support to sponsor the emergency board petition alongside disgruntled directors Richard Holloway and Susan Parker, who had long chafed under Richard's autocratic management style. Margaret warned me with characteristic sharp pragmatism that the impending confrontation would be fiercely contested by my father and sister, but praised my latent steel, officially scheduling the emergency board session for May 18th at 10 a.m. on the 42nd floor of Sinclair Tower. When news of the emergency petition reached Richard and Claire late that afternoon, their controlled composure immediately fractured into frantic panic, culminating in furious phone calls and violent door slammings down the office corridor, as Richard dismissed the maneuver as the senile rambling of an aging board member while remaining utterly blind to the impending storm. On the morning of May 18th, 2024, I ascended to the 42nd floor of Sinclair Tower, clad in a borrowed gray blazer that was 2 sizes too large, and carrying a Goodwill portfolio containing copies of the holographic will, evidentiary audio files, and structural notes. Intercepted outside the boardroom entrance by an immaculate Claire and an aggressive security detail attempting to bar my entry, I stood my ground until Margaret Coleman emerged from the walnut-paneled double doors, exercising her seniority as a 32-year board veteran to command that I be permitted entry as an authorized participant. Stepping into the prestigious boardroom, where portraits of past executives hung alongside the watchful gaze of Eleanor's painted eyes above the marble fireplace, I took my seat at the far end of the long table, flanked by Jonathan Ellis in the corner, while Robert Hartley, the distinguished board chairman who had known my grandmother for decades, officially called the emergency session to order. When Margaret yielded her floor time to me, Richard attempted to interject with patronizing theatricality, flanked by Claire, who publicly mocked my administrative standing and my historical struggles with dyslexia before the entire assembly. Refusing to be baited into an emotional defense of my cognitive processing, I calmly rose, bypassed their deprecating remarks, and placed the legally binding, properly notarized, last will and testament of Eleanor Sinclair directly onto the polished walnut table, asking Jonathan Ellis to formally testify to its absolute authenticity. As Ellis detailed the rigorous escrow arrangements maintained at Chase, private client, and Robert Hartley reviewed the binding legal provisions granting 51% of the corporate shares and absolute voting dominance to me, the color drained completely from Richard's face, while Claire stammered accusations of forgery and manipulation. When Richard attempted to invalidate the document by claiming mental incapacity on the part of his aging mother, I quietly retrieved my mobile phone and played the crystal clear audio recording of the 2018 board meeting, filling the silent boardroom with Richard's own voice, aggressively plotting to strip his mother of her foundational voting rights. The resulting silence was absolute and suffocating. Following a tense 45-minute recess, where corporate legal counsel conferred extensively with state court records and outside counsel, Chairman Hartley reconvened the assembly to officially confirm that the 2019 will superseded all prior legal instruments, legally establishing me as the majority shareholder and controlling authority of Sinclair Holdings. Seizing the historic moment, I stood before the 12 board members who had spent my entire life dismissing my existence, and rather than executing a destructive, retaliatory purge, I exercised the ultimate power move taught by my grandmother: mercy, structured through rigorous corporate governance. I formally introduced a motion of confidence regarding Richard's continued tenure as Chief Executive Officer, allowing the board to evaluate his leadership independently through an objective vote. When the ballots were cast, 7 directors voted no confidence against Richard, while 4 supported him, resulting in a decisive defeat that mandated his resignation within 30 days under corporate bylaws. As Richard stared across the table with a horrifying new expression of profound recognition and utter defeat, he stood in total silence and walked out of the boardroom forever, followed shortly by a broken Claire. In the weeks and months that followed, the structural fallout reshaped my entire universe. Richard formally resigned, Robert Hartley assumed interim executive leadership, and the board appointed me to a permanent, highly influential position as strategic advisor to the board, while dividends from my majority shareholding flowed steadily into my financial independence. Moving into a charming pre-war apartment in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the historic bridge my grandmother had traversed decades prior, I established a brand new corporate division within Sinclair Holdings, dedicated to sustainable development, environmental architecture, and green building innovations, fulfilling the visionary ideals Eleanor had always championed. Both my mother, Evelyn, and my sister, Claire, eventually sought me out independently over the subsequent months, participating in intensive psychological therapy and offering tearful, fractured apologies for their decades of emotional abandonment, recognizing at last that the rigid pursuit of elite perfection had constructed a gilded cage rather than a genuine family. While I chose not to recreate the hollow illusions of our shared past, I welcomed an honest, cautious baseline of communication, establishing healthy boundaries that allowed us to interact as autonomous human beings rather than oppressors and victims. Standing proudly beneath my grandmother's restored portrait hanging on my living room wall, I finally understood the profound truth of my inheritance. My dyslexia was never a flaw or a limitation, but rather the unique architectural lens that allowed me to perceive underlying structures, navigate systemic complexities, and uncover hidden truths when the rest of the world looked away. I no longer required external validation from parental approval, Ivy League credentials, or social prestige, because I had discovered that true worth is measured entirely by personal character, unwavering integrity, and the courage to stand up for justice when those around you choose the path of least resistance.